Hello, everyone. Welcome to today, on March 8th. We are going to be chatting about whose responsibility is Salesforce security anyway. And joining us today as part of the chat will be Ellis, who is an advisory CISO as part of Orca Security. He's also an author of 1% Leadership and part of the Hall of Fame for CISOs. And I'm Veroljub Mihajlovic. I'm a senior director here at Flosum, and we're going to be having a very interesting conversation about Salesforce and Salesforce security. What we'll do is we'll give it 15, 16 seconds, let some more folks join, and then we'll kick things off right off the bat. But as starting off with a conversation with you, Andy, what would be a great question to start off with is, as a CISO, what do you know about Salesforce? Not meaning it in a way that implies that you don't know very much, but how is Salesforce viewed in your world?
Oh no, I think that's a really fair question, because I think that Salesforce is one of the few apps that gets really well supported completely outside the rest of the company. Like you have these SaaS apps that people don't support, but like Salesforce is so mission critical for the revenue side of the business that, I know it's the CRM and there's a bunch of, other things it does. And I usually know, the thing I most know about Salesforce is, I can use it to go look things up, and I have on a regular basis. A friend of mine who's a CISO says, hey, I'm interested in your services. I know I can go look up in Salesforce to see if they're already in there, who their account team would be. And that Salesforce must have a really expensive licensing model, because anytime I don't use Salesforce for more than like 17 days, my access gets cut off and I have to ask again for it. So it's like the one application that I know who administers the access rights, because I always have to keep getting my access given back to me. And that's been persistent across every company I've ever been in.
Oh, that's funny. I think most folks on the webinar can relate with the expensive part and chasing after folks who are perhaps using some of the functionality of Salesforce. Yep. So now, this is your understanding of Salesforce, how you interact with it. You go into the CRM portion of Salesforce. With that understanding, what were your thoughts of how you interact with your level of understanding of Salesforce and the ecosystem? Who owns the security on Salesforce?
I think this is a growing challenge across the whole industry, because people are just starting to recognize that you need to own security for SaaS apps. Because historically, what we did is we said, well, we're doing business with a vendor. Like, is that vendor tall enough to have our data? So you do an audit, not of the platform, but an audit of the company. And you say, oh, do you abide by good security practices? Are you doing all of these things? And Salesforce has a great security team. They actually do a really great job, I think, of protecting the platform. But what we often forget about is, like, who configures Salesforce? Who's responsible for that configuration control? And that's really a problem that most CISOs are just waking up to in general. Hopefully Salesforce, they might be paying a little more attention to. After all, it is sort of our crown jewels. But yeah, I think in a lot of enterprises, it's not clear who owns Salesforce security, right? Does that fall under IT? Does it fall under, sales operations? Does that fall under InfoSec? It's not actually an easy answer there.
Oh, so very interesting. So you're saying that you're really involved with the process of selecting vendor qualification and the initial portion of Salesforce, and then afterwards, functional security or the day-to-day security of Salesforce is a little bit of no man's land right now.
Yeah, it's sort of it's the belt and suspenders problem. We often talk about the shared responsibility model for cloud, which I hate that phrase, because there's nothing shared about it. It's all, everybody's pointing at each other. And you sort of assume that, the vendor provides the pants and you provide the shirt of how you use it. But what often gets left out is that you have to configure the pants correctly. That's the belt or suspenders. Like, what holds that security up? Because if you don't set it up correctly, it doesn't matter how good the platform was at securing your data on the back end if you've left your data wide open on the front end, because they had controls, but they weren't set up by default, or you didn't set them up in the right way.
That's particularly of importance. If I were to tell you, Andy, for example, that Salesforce has recently, or over the last 10 years, really expanded its capabilities to start making storefront, start making customer experience, customer management, and becoming more and more of a revenue driver for the business, and enables low code and folks from that are declared developers and some developers to start kicking up and creating a lot of for the organization. And then now where we are in a situation is perhaps a team of 50, 60 developers are required to support Salesforce and the ongoing efforts for the business. How would your conversation, your thought process change now that you know that there's maybe 50 developers behind the scenes working on an array of apps that bring in revenue?
Yeah, so I sort of want to work that one backwards, because the idea that there are 50 developers is not actually a huge surprise for me. Like that one I've certainly seen, which is, you maybe do your ticketing system inside Salesforce, and you're trying to integrate 18 different processes, and you've got a developer team for that, and maybe put in, commission calculation goes into Salesforce. And so the idea that there's a Salesforce ecosystem, not super surprising. It's your revenue stream is actually like this eye opener. And it's not really a big eye opener in that, of course, they would do this. Why would you not? Everybody wants to build a walled garden where they control all of your data. So it's a logical move for Salesforce. But the way that we've thought about Salesforce as this back end application, right? It's back office, clearly not true anymore. But this is now front of the house. If Salesforce goes down or we configure it incorrectly, that's our revenue stream might have just gone away for a while. So that's changes the level at which I think we need to care about how we're using Salesforce and what we're doing with it. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it for revenue. If it's going to increase our revenue, of course, that's a great thing. But we should make sure that we're treating it as a revenue generating app.
I think I heard a key word there, back office. So now that it's exposed to a little bit more of the customers and the external world outside of, the confines of what we would call a green zone or back office. How does that change your perspective in terms of what is the capabilities or the exposure of the surface that now is allowed through this platform?
Yeah, and I think the challenge is when we think about production revenue generating apps, we have a very different model for how we manage security and even just configuration control. Like in most production environments, we think of configuration as code. Whether it's code or not, you still run it through the same development pipeline because you really care that you have zero outages. On a back office application, while the application support team wants there to be zero outages, the rest of the company is like, well, we'll kind of tolerate if you click a button and you shut down Salesforce for 5 minutes. It's not the end of the world. Like, who's affected? Maybe 100 sales reps. Not a great day for us to have that, but that's very different than the whole world sees that we can't buy anything. So that's sort of what it changes for me, is this urgency of sort of how much you have to be paying attention to the security and the reliability of everything that's going on and how you're affecting that.
So where this comes to is now you have quite a few developers, and they have the capabilities of interacting with the applications that are forward-facing, back office. Now we talk about a very specific word here: developers.
Yep.
Developers and security. How do you treat developers and security as a CISO?
So, developers is really where a lot of security happens. The people that are responsible for security, I think I used that phrase earlier, at the end of the day, the CISO owns the security of the company, but the CISO doesn't actually implement security most of the time. Most of the time it's implemented, by a developer or by a program manager who's in a business unit, whereas security is providing advice and guidance. Hey, here's what you should do. Here's what you need to think about. And the challenge is, especially in a no-code or low-code environment, is we don't often treat the developers there the same way that we treat the developers in a full-stack environment. In a full-stack environment, we start by saying you own everything in the system, top to bottom, and you have to be very careful. When you're in a low-code or no-code, first of all, a lot of people look down on developers in that environment. It's just a truth. I'm not saying we should, but there's a lot of people like, oh, well, all you're doing is clicking a bunch of buttons. What is that really? And the answer is, sure, you're assembling in a higher level language. You have a lot of abstraction that's supporting you, but you can make just as many mistakes by clicking buttons. There's certain mistakes you're unlikely to make, like typos are harder, memory leaks are harder. There's a bunch of low-level things you're not likely to do. But there's a lot of high-level things that become very easy to do. Oh, you check this box, and it accidentally turned off, TLS. Hopefully Salesforce doesn't let you do that. But a lot of those boxes are very powerful. And so those developers who are responsible for security, but have often been ignored because, their platform is, it's just a SaaS application or really just a PaaS. So this is a platform as a service. It means that they're not getting the same attention and being taught the same skills around security as they ought to be.
And then this leaves the organization under a much larger exposure or threat level, perhaps because folks have the ability to change these permissions in the security posture.
Right. And especially if we don't know who has what permissions. I can trace in a full stack environment, I can look at any change and ask the question, who made that change? And there are, so many different infrastructures that will tell me exactly where that change got committed into code, who pushed it, who authorized it being in a release. Like, I have all this evidence. When it comes to like this application that, somebody just went and clicked the button and changed it, there might not be a ticket associated with it. There might be, but there might not be. There's probably not, though, a tie between the ticket and the change. So it's hard for me to go like find where the change happened and see that there's, a change request associated with it. I might not even be able to find the log. Maybe there's some set of logs of everything that happens in the environment that says, this change was changed at this point. But it's not this like very simple, easy to interact with thing we get out of the massive logging infrastructures that we tend to build in full stack development environments.
And you bring up something really interesting about a mature CI/CD pipeline and a mature process. Out of the box, Salesforce does not really have a full CI/CD capability as we know it from custom app development. A lot of it has been built out around something called change sets, which is a personification of click, not code approach in how you're pushing the production. So the level of auditability and traceability is not there to the level of extent that you'd be used from a custom app development perspective. Is this a surprise to you?
I mean, it's a bit of a surprise, but I mean, I've interacted with applications like this before, so I'm not wholly surprised. The fact that there's even change sets is at least a step in the right direction, which presumably means you can queue up a set of changes and batch them as a group and hopefully revert them and say, hey, I want to undo all those changes because I broke something. That's at least a step better than most, click-based development environments have. Like if I go on my WordPress instance, there's no concept of change sets. If I screw something up, I've got to figure out which of the 15 changes I just made it might be and undo each one manually. Right? That's sort of the lowest case. Change sets is a move in the right direction, but it's not really the whole solution that I think I'd be looking for.
And that makes complete sense. So with this level of awareness of, hey, mission critical applications that are revenue generating are now part of the Salesforce ecosystem. You have a suite of developers, and based off the goodness of what Salesforce delivers, you have declarative developers that are also working with very seasoned developers to generate all these applications. So now, what are some themes or things that you should have concerns about where you have a mix of developers, both seasoned and unseasoned, are getting up to speed with what the development lifecycle is, generating applications and moving things forward with the software development lifecycle?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to be concerned about a number of things. The first one, easiest thing in security is to always say, let's worry about access control. And the thing that sort of would worry me here is the environment that the developer is interacting with seems like it's going to be the same environment that the administrator is interacting with, which is the same environment a user might be. Like they might have different, capabilities in them, but all of them have the ability to check boxes and change configuration. Maybe locally for the user, who just wants to see different things, or for an admin, they're turning on and off some capabilities. Developers are turning on and off more things to support their applications. So one of my worries is, I can't just simply look at it and say, well, if you're not a developer, you don't have access to the ecosystem at all, right? Complete thing we do in full stack environments is you have a development environment, you don't get to write code if you're an operator, right? There's this completely different set of permissions that start at the system layer. I'm not doing it inside the system. So I lose that benefit, so I'm going to have to pay a little more attention there. But the second one comes down to this ecosystem question, which is like we write apps, presumably as our company. Like we've got 50 developers. Hopefully they're actually writing applications, but we're also bringing in third-party applications in that are function within the Salesforce ecosystem. And as soon as I have this mesh of applications, I'm going to worry who has what permissions. Is it that, we integrated this app and the person who integrated it said, oh, let's just give it access to all records. Doesn't need access to all records, but that was the easiest thing to do. So I'm going to have to watch for where is my data flowing, who actually gets, what really is the most valuable data I own is my CRM. I think everybody likes to talk about their IP being, what's in your development environment and your source code. But honestly, the list of people who pay you money is pretty much the most valuable thing the company owns.
Oh, and then that's absolutely perfect. And then the concept of ongoing and managing least privilege becomes a little bit of a challenge with how many different folks are in there working away at it with the different capabilities of changing the permission level. So for example, the joiners, movers, leavers concept, extremely hard to manage at an enterprise level, and especially if you have developers that are making changes as the process goes along. Have you seen any issues with the joiners, movers, leavers process?
I mean, it's a big challenge because you're now not talking about just access to the application, but rights within it. Often joiners, movers, leavers, for those not familiar with it, that's as somebody joins the company, as they move inside the company, and as they leave the company, how do you make sure they end up with the right access rights? Maybe it means something different in the Salesforce world, but in the security side, that's how we use it. And how do you make sure that when somebody moves, they get the right access rights? And the dirty little secret in most companies is you do access management at the application. And so as somebody like moves into sales, you say, oh, let me give them Salesforce access as if they're in sales. And when they go to engineering, you say, well, let me take away their Salesforce access. But what if somebody is in sales and then moves to engineering, but they're Salesforce development, but then they go back into sales? Will anybody notice and realize, oh, we need to take away their development access in Salesforce, but leave them with the sales view, right? Because it's not just simple trigger of they lose all of the access. They're only losing pieces of it. And that's where things usually fall through the cracks in a company.
Mm-hmm. And then as you were mentioning, the CRM being the most valuable thing that your company can own, also lots of permissioning levels from the aspect of who has the ability to read, write, download all, view all. All of these complex and very specific data things are really important for you to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I think people don't often really understand how valuable that CRM is, but I'll put it in real simple terms. For your company, think about how much money you spend on marketing, right? And the whole purpose of marketing functionally is to find a set of prospects and get them to some stage in your sales pipeline, probably stage 3, for a lot of companies, right? That's sort of the goal, is if I can get you to stage 3, you're a great MQL, I can hand you over to a sales rep, right? So the list of stage 3s, what is the value of that? Well, the simple answer is everything you spend on marketing. So your entire marketing budget results in this pipeline of stage 3s. If you lost access to that, somebody else, like one of your competitors, wouldn't even need a marketing team, because as soon as you call up and say, hey, we've got you to a qualified state, we know you're interested, hey, let's do a trial, your competitor just calls up and they're, all they're doing is looking inside your Salesforce and saying, oh, hey, I see someone just called you, let me call you also, right? They're not even doing a first call, they get to a follow-up.
Yes, exactly. And what is even complicating the ecosystem a little bit more, and something perhaps people don't talk enough about, both from a security perspective and the Salesforce perspective here, is machine identity and digital identity. So now you have this problem, but perhaps quadrupled or quintupled with machine identities. You mind maybe taking us through with what you think about digital identities and how this relates to the Salesforce ecosystem?
Yeah, so this is one of the hardest places in application security, is how do you deal with machine identities? And really, when you think about a machine identity, it's basically any identity that is not tied to a human interacting with a keyboard, right? And so sometimes it could be an automated process, could be an automated process for one person, and so they need a machine identity that's going to run this process for them. It could be for another application, so it can authenticate who it is. And the challenge is, You can't use standard multi-factor authentication, which is all tied around making a human prove that they're really at the keyboard, because the whole point of a machine identity is it's not a human at a keyboard. And you'll see a lot of places where humans will try to figure out, how do I take my identity and just make it a machine identity and not tell anyone? So if you just do password authentication, let me type my password into a script that runs on my desktop. But whatever they're doing, however they're authenticating their machine identity, the loss of the authenticator is a problem. Because if somebody, compromises that developer's desktop, they get the password or the API key, now they get to do everything that machine identity could do. And so that is worrisome, especially because as machine identities sort of connect in this mesh and data moves from one application to another, you don't necessarily even know what's in an application. You might have a machine identity that says, I'm just accessing the test and production infrastructure, but there happens to be a machine identity in that infrastructure that's connecting into production and copying all your production data over into test. So this identity that only had access to test actually has access to your production data. Like, you can't modify your production data, so you're safe against that, but it can do other things. And so the challenge that we have with machine identities is they're usually the ways that adversaries are going to move, follow some attack path in our environment, where they get access to one thing and the machine identity gives them access to something bigger and better from their perspective.
So they could move laterally and try to creep up their privileges and escalate their attacks.
And in fact, we've seen a number of compromises recently that look like this, where an adversary compromises one company, gets a machine identity, whether it's a PowerShell script on a shared drive or an API key, and then uses that identity to often connect into a completely different enterprise or a different part of the business, and move until they get information that's interesting to them. So any machine identity with access to your Salesforce records becomes an avenue for an adversary to get into Salesforce and start behaving like a legitimate user, except they're doing illegitimate things.
Mm-hmm. And it's all part of the ecosystem of where people or adversarial actors are trying to get and land and expand within an organization. Doesn't mean necessarily that Salesforce will be the target of the attack, but they are trying to spread their influence and creep towards whatever valuable targets they're looking for.
Right. And often adversaries don't have a target in mind, right? They're just looking and saying, well, what do I have? Oh, look, I have a key to Salesforce. Well, Salesforce might not have been on their targeting list, but they're not going to ignore it. We say, okay, well, let me go see what I can look at. Oh, I've connected to Salesforce. Oh, I can see all of your government accounts, and maybe I'm a nation state actor for a different government. That's very interesting to me.
And this is, we've been talking a little bit about machine identities, which are unknown perhaps to the average person when thinking about security in Salesforce. Yep. But what about human risks, such as malicious or accidental?
So when I think about human risks, I like to use a variant of the Microsoft guidelines for inclusive design. I love these. They have nothing to do with security. They're all about building inclusive systems. And they talk about their, people that are permanently with a given disability. There are people who are temporarily with it and people who are situationally with it. Think about being one-armed. There's very few people who are permanently one-armed on the planet. So for most businesses, they would never develop for a one-armed user because they're so rare. But when you think of people who are temporarily one-armed, because they're wearing in a sling, they broke an arm, whatever, like you might have somebody who for 4 weeks is functionally a one-armed user, so you design for them. And then you have the situationally one-armed people. A lot of us have done we show up in our car, we've got a bag of groceries in one hand, or maybe we're holding a baby in one hand. You only have one arm to do anything with. So we can apply the same principle to security, especially the insiders. I think the insider threat is generally overblown when people talk about malicious employees that work for you today. Right? Very few companies are ever actually going to have to worry about that. But with a human identity, it's not actually the human who's doing anything. It's the human's computer. Everything is actually coming from the computer. And so if someone compromises the computer, they get to do everything your human used to be able to do. So you have taken what was a human, where you would worry about, this permanent adversary human who hates you, not a lot of those, to a temporary human who hates you, which is the adversary who's sitting inside your employee's computer. A lot more of those look exactly the same. And then occasionally you get what I think of as the situational human who doesn't like you, which is your employee. And often it's security that they don't like. It's like, oh, why can't I get this thing done? You put this process in my way. It's a pain to do it. I hate working in the Salesforce interface, but I have this handy little download button to download all of my accounts to a spreadsheet. And so I'll just work in a Google spreadsheet. Well,
getting PII data.
Right now, PII has just been dumped into Google Sheets, and who has access to that? Or maybe it's just on their laptop, and when they leave the company, did they walk away with all of this data, even potentially by accident? But now that they've walked away with this data, they can potentially use it at their next job.
One of the things that comes out of the box with Salesforce is a backup solution where you back everything up with CSVs, and then there are manual processes where IT administrators or the backup team would download these CSVs and then be responsible for hosting it themselves. So you can see how this is a proliferation, or perhaps not necessarily meeting all of these compliance requirements.
Yeah, I wonder how many people think carefully about controlling the access to those CSVs. Are they encrypting them and putting them somewhere safe, or are they just downloading to their desktop, then copying them into maybe a file share with restricted access, but they don't delete the copy that's sitting on their desktop?
So now, from your perspective, what are some business challenges? And I think people think about security, especially on SaaS apps, around compliance and audit requirements. What are some unqualified and quantified risks of not meeting security compliance and not being able to meet an audit requirement from a CISO's perspective?
Well, I think here's the good news, which is most auditors don't know enough to talk about SaaS applications. At best, they're talking about, hey, do you do an access rights review either once a quarter or once a year? And for those of you who've never been part of one, it's when the application owner downloads this awful spreadsheet listing every access right anybody in the company has. They probably stick it into Google Sheets, and then they send a mail out to every manager of anybody who's on that list and says, please go read this and tell us if we need to change anything. If not, just mark the button that says yes for your employees. And basically every manager, if they're diligent, sends this to their employees and says, hey, make sure that you have what you need. And if they're not diligent, they just write the word yes, because their employees are all going to say yes anyway. It's too complex, it's too complicated. We distribute it out. But fortunately, the auditors don't know much better. So they're like, well, as long as every quarter or every year you go through this process, whether it did anything meaningful doesn't matter. But they stop there because nobody has really thought about the configuration and the DevOps process inside a SaaS app as being a place we need to apply the same set of controls we would apply in a full stack engineering group to make sure that we know who's making the changes, that they're approved, that, if they might affect our revenue, there's now Sarbanes-Oxley implications. Like, how many people who put a storefront in Salesforce just thought about the fact that Salesforce is now a SOX app? And, are your developers following all the SOX processes? I mean, the reality is your normal developers in a full stack environment aren't really following all of them anyway. But that's your single biggest risk around compliance, is the day that an auditor shows up and says, hey, I need to audit the following 20 things in Salesforce to make sure that you have good controls here. And if you have been ignoring it, all of a sudden you're going to have to throw in whatever controls the auditor thinks are appropriate, which might not be appropriate for your business.
And I think this brings about two themes or two things that are happening in wider ecosystem. So one of them is the National Cybersecurity Act is talking about making C-levels actually personally responsible for any not being able to do the right security deep dive and understanding what the security potential issues are, and having a risk containment and management plan and process in place with up to 5 years of bonus as a monetary figure being put out there right now as as an actual fine for not following due diligence.
Yep.
What do you think about that, and how do you think that this will change the name of the game of how people think about security, and or especially around SaaS apps?
Yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to see how all the various changes that are being proposed, and some are further down the pipeline. The SEC is about to put out some new rules around cybersecurity, and I think some of the ways they're talking about it will include it at the same level as some of the financial reporting, diligence errors, and I think that is going to be concerning. I think especially concerning is I think there's been a trend, especially in public companies, to start to include the CISO in the sign-offs, even though the CISO is almost never part of the C-level within a company. Like, they have the title, but they do not report to the CEO. They're not in the CEO staff meeting. They're not actually making the business decisions about security. They're implementing, they're driving change. But at the end of the day, the strategic decision-making is happening above their level. And so I think we're going to see this interesting tension as companies say, hey, well, we do have a CISO and they're the ones accountable. And, is the SEC going to believe that when there's a breach and the CISO says, hey, like, here's my documentation that I said we should do something differently. And the only thing I was signing was saying that the board was aware, or the CEO was aware of the risks. So I think you're going to probably start to see a lot more CISOs trying to do that CYA activity of making sure that these risks are well documented. And I think that's a place that will potentially drive CISOs to pay more attention into their SaaS apps and into Salesforce, because that's a place that if right now you're not looking and that's where your breach happens, then I think the responsibility is going to end with you, because your job was to tell the business where the risk lived.
And one of the major Forrester predictions of 2023 is that there will be a major breach in low-code platforms in 2023. As a CISO, what do you do about going about, let's say that for Salesforce, how do you go about tackling this threat and this potential of happening on Salesforce?
So the first thing I would do is I would go find my Salesforce app owner. There always is one. If you don't know who it is, probably call your CIO and ask them, because it's one of the few, I think, CIO-led applications that's consistently run by a CIO. And I think you need to sit down and first do that in learning. Because what you think your company's doing with Salesforce might not be what your company is doing. So you should say, hey, I understand Salesforce is key and critical to our business, and I want to help make sure that we're doing the right things, that we are protecting it. And that starts by understanding what we do with it. So first, learn how your business is using Salesforce, because what you don't want to do is repeat what you've done for every other third-party vendor, which is said, oh, well, we're just going to send them a checklist, make sure that the company can answer the checklist, and if they can, we're good, right? For me, it always starts by asking one of my favorite questions to ask vendors. It makes them very uncomfortable, which is, how can I shoot myself in the foot with this application? What are the most common things that your customers do that result in them having a bad day? Because I don't want to do those things, and I need to make sure that my application owner knows what they are so that they don't do those things. So I think that's where you really start with your conversation. I recently actually wrote sort of a guidebook on this for cloud services that I think could be easily ported over to Salesforce. It's called How to CISO in the Cloud, so you can just Google it and go find that. I did that with Orca. But I think that the methodology of understand what your business does, understand how you use your applications, and then you can make decisions about what your policy should be and how you're going to execute a security strategy. But it ultimately is going to come down to, do you have a way to test whether or not your company is doing the right practices on this platform?
And that's absolutely perfect. And what Flosum has the capability of doing is we have a Salesforce organizational scanner, which allows you, and I'll show everyone here real quick. We have the ability to give you an understanding of your current security posture. And we'll share it real quick right here.
Well, that's awesome.
Second, we'll share it here. What we do is we take a scan of your organization with admin and security permissions. Of course, you have to be able to go through here, and we give a overall understanding of what your current posture is, and then get into.
I'm sorry for whoever you audited to get this D score. Clearly, they've got some work to do.
And what we provide is what are the most common things that they are not being addressed. So some of these things can be functionally corrected within your organization. But to automate this, we have something called Trust Center, which is a full DevSecOps solution that automates your capabilities of being able to manage this functionally and ongoing throughout the future.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Process.
So I've got a question. So one of the things I love to do with vendors myself is I like to say, do you have an easy way for me to connect, get that view during a POC so I can demonstrate that there's risk that I could then use your tool to manage?
So we have this organizational scanner that's available for free online, and you can get the report by connecting your organization and running the report.
There you
And
go.
we offer a service to talk to a Flosum expert where you can find out more information. We can deep dive into some of the challenges that you're having and how to set this up to be an ongoing remediation process.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you're a CISO and you've got questions about Salesforce, go talk to your Salesforce owner, potentially ask them to, do this org scanner, take a look at it together and make a decision about what you need to do. Because ultimately, like if you're the CISO, you're probably not the buyer, but you probably want to make sure that your application is buying and using this application, that you get visibility into what's happening.
Perfect. And then Andy, one more question for you, and I left this purposely for the end is, in your experience, it's going to be your favorite question as a CISO. In your experience, who do you define as the owner of security? Is it the allocated staff owner of the platform, IT, InfoSec, security, your security team, or is it a committee?
So the actual ultimate answer is whoever gets to say yes or no. So, which is never actually the information security organization, much as they like to pretend it is. The actual owner for security is the business unit. So it's whichever executive gets to say what we're doing. So ultimately the CEO, but then often down through a product organization. And so they're the ones who own security. What security does is we're an enabler who advises and guides the company. Like we should be a helpful guide to a safer destiny for all of our stakeholders. And so it's our job to make sure that they know what their security issues are, what their risks are, that if we don't agree with the choices that they're making, that we escalate that, because it is on us to ensure that the security decisions of the company that are interesting and relevant are being made at the right levels. And sometimes that is not the owner, it's the owner's boss.
And ultimately, I think how creating the policies and the highest level security posture at the organization is security's responsibility, but how that gets translated into each of the apps and business units requires development and understanding within the particular SaaS application.
Yep. And even when you say the policy is created by security, we drive that process, and we're probably going to do a lot of input, and we're going to make sure that we end up with a policy. But security doesn't, excuse me, doesn't get to sit in a vacuum and say, oh, here's what the policy is, and then say, hey, everybody else go deal with this. Right? That policy needs to be driven by the business. It needs to be consistent with the business. It's just InfoSec is the ones who make sure that there is a policy.
Perfect. Andy, thank you very much for your time here today. We're wonderful having a conversation with you. What we'll be doing is we'll be sending a link to talking to a Flosum expert about how to get started with your organizational scan, as well as a follow-up email afterwards. And then we'd like to thank everyone for their time. And Andy, pleasure as always having a conversation with you.
Yeah, great to chat with you, V.
All right, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.